On this channel, I have talked about the disappearance of the SS Pacific. She was a Collins Line vessel that vanished without a trace in the mid-1850s, and is perhaps the most famous of her line of sister ships for that mystery. But one ship that I haven't talked about is one of her sister ships, the all but forgotten SS Arctic, which sank in a disaster that simply sounds like a nightmare or the plot of some historical fiction story. But the story of the Arctic is true, and so are all of the nightmarish and utterly tragic details. So today I'm going to tell you that story of this woefully forgotten, obscure ocean liner whose story absolutely does deserve to be told and remembered. This is the story of the SS Arctic, a forgotten, nightmarish story. The Arctic was a steamship for the American company Collins Line. She was a side paddle wheel steamer, just like the Pacific and their two sister ships were. These unique-looking, gorgeous vessels existed in what I've called the hybrid phase of ships. A relatively small period of time, but due to the ones that in this time period only existing in that small window, as steam was slowly replacing sail power in ships. This resulted in some very unique-looking hybrid mixes of later steamships and the previous sailing ships. The Arctic herself weighed 2,856 tons, she was 284 feet long, and she had a beam of 45 feet, and a draught of 19 feet, and a depth of 32 feet. The Arctic, as I said, belonged to the Collins Line. In 1849, the Collins Line had a chance to become a strong contender in the highly competitive transatlantic trade market. That year, the U.S. Postmaster General Office invited different American companies to submit bids and proposals for a 10-year government-subsidized mail service control which would run between New York and Liverpool. We've talked about why this, especially the schedule the ships had to keep, might have become a safety issue in the video where we covered their liner Pacific. This service was hoped to be a direct competitor to the Cunard Line. The Collins Line submitted their plan to operate a weekly service route with a fleet of 5 ships, and this proposal convinced the authorities to give the line the mail services contract. The Arctic and her sister ships, Atlantic, Baltic, and Pacific, were all built to be luxurious liners. Arctic herself was launched on January 28, 1850, and she was described as an air of almost oriental magnificence and gorgeous yet beautiful apartment, brilliant, with light presenting as cheerful a scene as the heart could crave. With all this love it seems people had for her, she was even the most celebrated of the 4 sister ships. It makes what happened on September 27, 1854, all the more tragic. The Arctic had left Liverpool for New York on September 20th, 1854. She was carrying somewhere between 250 and 300 passengers on board her, 100 of which were women and children. 150 crew accompanied the 300-ish passengers, and on the morning of September 21st, as the ship passed near Cape Clear, the southernmost point of Ireland, she began traveling at full speed ahead, 13 knots or 15 miles per hour. For the next week, the voyage was uneventful, though the weather was settling around her throughout the voyage. On the morning of September 27th, she was at the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland, and she was caught in a dense fog. Cold water was coming down from the north on the Labrador Current and was meeting warm water coming up from the Gulf Stream, and the result was an ever-increasing amount of dense fog. Like her sister ship Pacific would do on the voyage she vanished on, the Arctic continued to plow ahead at full speed. Captain Luce observed the conditions on September 27th and said, "At intervals of a few minutes, there was a very dense fog, followed by being sufficiently clear to see 1 or 2 miles. And be it that he worked for a company that required the ship to make the crossing from Europe to North America in a certain duration of time, he did not order the ship to slow down, but instead continued to plow on." He calculated that the ship was somewhere around 50 miles southeast of Cape Race in Newfoundland. Minutes later, his ship steamed into a particularly dense bank of fog. All seemed normal and still, but then the lookout saw something terrifying. Shortly after the captain left the bridge, there was something ahead. Materializing out of the fog ahead was another shape. The shape of another ship bearing right down on the Arctic. He gave the crew a warning, and the officer of the watch ordered, "Hard a starboard!" and the engines were ordered to be stopped and reversed. Then, they could only watch as the ship came closer out of the fog and bore down on them. Captain Luce heard the commotion and came back out on deck just in time for the ship to strike the Arctic. The SS Vesta, the vessel which had struck the Arctic, plowed into her between her bow and starboard paddle wheel. In an eerie similarity to the Titanic decades later, many of the passengers only felt a slight bump, and so did the captain. He thought his ship was relatively uninjured. Many of the passengers were in the middle of drawing the daily lottery and paid the slight shake no mind. In the Arctic saloon, a passenger named William Guion said he only perceived a slight shake, although it was scarcely more than a tremor or a quiver. Glasses on tables rattled, one or two maybe fell over. Someone here or there might have thought the shaking peculiar, but nothing more than an oddity that would be forgotten in minutes. For the next several minutes, everything continued as normal for the passengers. Guion went back to his conversation with fellow passenger like the bump had never happened. Neither of us entertained any idea at the time that the Arctic had sustained injury, he said. Little did any of them know, at that very moment, water was gushing uncontrollably into the ship and the collision was indeed a death blow. Though many didn't think the Arctic suffered any major damage, the same could not be said for the Vesta. Captain Luce thought the Vesta seemed to be literally cut or crushed off for full 10 feet. Believing his ship was not seriously damaged, he made to assist the Vesta, on which panic had already broken out. He ordered the Arctic's 6 lifeboats to be launched and ferried over to the Vesta to assist her crew. Arctic circled around the Vesta, but only one boat was launched before Captain Luce canceled his order and issued new ones. He noticed that the Arctic was beginning to take on a telltale list and began to worry the damage was more severe than he thought. He also noticed that debris from the Vesta, such as her anchor, were impaled into the Arctic's wooden hull at the point of the collision. Second Officer William Balham was ordered to make an inspection of the damage and assess the ship. 2 large breaches were below the waterline, with 18 more above it, and as the ship settled lower, more and more water would be let in through those other breaches. As the Arctic had no watertight compartments, unlike the Vesta, it was suddenly clear from this brief inspection that the ship was doomed if nothing was done at that exact moment. Precious minutes had already been lost, and the race against the clock was now on. Meanwhile, as Second Officer William Balham made his inspection of the damage and assessed the vessel, the mood among many of the passengers began to change as the ship took on a noticeable list and more learned about what had happened. Among the passengers who were on board included the wife of the Collins Line founder, Mrs. Edward Collins, who had their 19-year-old daughter, Mary Ann, and their 15-year-old son, Henry, with her. Mrs. Collins's brother and his wife were on board as well. There was also William B. Brown, his wife Clara, their 2 infant children, 2 of William's sisters, one of whom, Maria Miller Millie Brown, was a friend of the ship's captain. Also on board was Captain Luce's partially disabled 11-year-old son, William Robert Luce. As the passengers grew uneasy and news of the collision was spreading throughout the ship, Captain Luce attempted to plug the holes. Meanwhile, the ship's pumps were working at full capacity. The plug was just a canvas sail, and it was torn apart by the debris still clinging to the hull of the ship. When they reattempted with something else, the open holes were already too far below the waterline to be plugged. Meanwhile, the lower holds and hulls of the ship were steadily filling with an unstoppable flood of water. Finally, the severity of the situation hit Captain Luce, and he knew that unless he and his crew did something quick, the Arctic, pride of the Collins Line, would sink. His choice was to make a mad dash. The nearest point of land was Cape Race, 50 miles away. Captain Luce decided to make a mad dash for it and try to beach the ship in shallow water. Land was 4 hours away from their position, but they had no choice if they wanted to save the ship. They abandoned the Vesta, knowing if they stayed, both ships would likely sink, and the mad dash to land began. The Arctic plowed ahead at full speed, and at this moment was when one of the first tragic losses of life occurred in the disaster. When the Arctic began her run, one of Vesta's lifeboats had drifted in front of the bow, and the Arctic plowed into it, killing dozens of occupants instantly as they were swept alongside her hull and crushed under the paddle wheels. One person from this lifeboat survived, but the Arctic sailed on, running for land at full speed. Meanwhile, inside her hull, the water was continuing to rise. Corridors were flooding, and the forward sections of the ship were filling. The water soon overwhelmed the pumps, began to rise uncontrollably, and extinguished the boiler fires. By 1 in the afternoon, the Arctic was dead in the water. Her beating heart had stopped and never was to be restarted. She was stranded, far from land, with no help nearby, and sinking. Captain Luce, knowing the race was lost, then ordered the lifeboats to be launched. The Arctic carried 6 lifeboats. These boats could carry a total of 180 people. Over 400 people were on board the sinking liner. The lifeboats themselves were steel constructed, but one of them had already been launched, as I mentioned earlier, and it was left behind when the ship began her run for land, meaning they were down to 5. This left room for approximately 150 people in the boats. It was more than enough room for the women and children, and as you'll recall from the HMS Birkenhead story I told, women and children first was an unofficial policy following that disaster. The Arctic's quartermaster started the evacuation with the port guard boat. At first, the women and children were loaded into the boat in a relatively neat order. However, a group of male passengers suddenly rushed the boat to claim whatever spots remained. Once lowered, it was ordered to remain close to the ship, but it pulled away rapidly. Meanwhile, on the Arctic, panic was breaking out. The passengers were realizing the number of spots in the boats was far too few for them all. The port quarter boat was then loaded with 12 women and 5 crew, but as it was being prepared to be lowered, it was rushed by more members of the crew, and in the resulting chaos, the boat upended, sending all but 3 of those on board into the water below. All those who were not left clinging to the boat drowned. Meanwhile, as the Arctic settled lower and lower in the water and more of her hulls flooded, on the starboard side, Captain Luce ordered his second officer to launch the starboard guard boat and take it to the stern of the ship so the women and children could be passed to it directly, since the ship was settling by the stern. However, just like the port boat, as soon as it was launched, it was suddenly attacked by a mob of men who leapt into the water and climbed aboard. Now that it was full, Balham ignored Luce's orders and drifted away from the sinking ship. Meanwhile, on the port side, the upended boat was righted, and despite the crew trying to get the women and children into the boat, it was again rushed by panicked male passengers who pushed the women and children out of the way, and then once they were in, they cut the boat free from the ship and drifted away with it only partially filled. At the same time, near the stern, one of the 2 remaining lifeboats was commandeered by the chief engineer and some of his men. They insisted they needed the boat so they could make a final attempt at plugging the holes in the ship. However, when people started questioning them, they pulled guns on them. This boat was then loaded with food and water, and it left the ship only half full. All those on board were engine room staff who threatened anyone who came near them with firearms. Of the crew trying to maintain order, only one officer, 4th Officer Francis Dorian, and Captain Luce now remained on board the stricken ship. All the engineers and seamen were gone, leaving them and a few crew on board with roughly 300 panicked passengers. Only one lifeboat now remained on the Arctic, and the ship was beginning to sink rapidly. Up to this point, it had been growing at a more noticeable pace, but it wasn't a plunge. Now the ship was taking one, going down stern first with a strong list to starboard. Seeing the number of people left trapped on board the ship, most of them women and children, including his own son, a now desperate Captain Luce ordered his ship's trainer engineer, Steward Holland from Washington, D.C., to go to the bow and station himself there and fire the ship's signal cannon at 1-minute intervals in a last desperate attempt to attract any nearby ships that might have been lurking in the fog. Holland would stand there until the very moment the ship sank out from under him, and he would not survive. The Baltimore Sun later called him a conqueror of death. That noble ship had many noble spirits on board, but none nobler than he. Captain Luce, meanwhile, said, "The fate of the ship will be mine." And as the chaos broke out, as the Arctic began to sink, he took his son and climbed onto the starboard side command post above the starboard paddle wheel. There he would wait for the end. He was not the only one accepting their fate. Many stranded passengers huddled together in groups, offering words of comfort and saying prayers and singing hymns and reciting scripture. The image it paints in the mind is a touching and tragic one, even to those who are not religious or spiritual. Others, meanwhile, still made a final desperate attempt to escape, fashioning rafts from chairs, stools, sofas, doors, and whatever else that would float. All this was accompanied by the cannon being fired once every minute. Inside the ship, hallways were submerging, cabins were flooding, tables and chairs were floating, glasses were sliding off tables, and the ship was making crumbling and cracking sounds as the water pressure on her hull increased. The description reminds me of the film A Night to Remember. Though about the Titanic, many of the moments in that movie could be placed directly as they are in a film about this story. Passengers saying a prayer together on the ship as it takes her final plunge, others fighting in the water, others still panicking and trying to create rafts. All the while, the water level rises and swallows more of the ship as she takes her final plunge into the ocean. And that is the part of the story we are at, the sinking.
Prayer. We ought to say a prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Hallowed be thy name.
Thy kingdom come.
Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done in earth.
Господи, благи живота моего.
You have to wait for the oil of hair all above a
Ske din vilja, så som i himmelen så på jorden.
Oh God!
Power and glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Passenger Peter McCabe said of the scene to the New York Times in 1854, "Several persons were floating about on doors and beds. I seized hold of a door, which had been taken down to save passengers, and went into the sea, where I left the door and got upon the raft. A great many persons were trying to get on the raft. Among the number who were on it, I saw 4 ladies. Many of those who were on the raft he described died when the raft got caught up by the sinking ship and was torn apart, spilling its occupants into the ocean and chaos of the sinking ship." The time was now 4:54 p.m., and it had been 4.5 hours since the collision, and the Arctic's cannon is fired for the final time. Moments later, the Arctic sank stern first into the sea with as many as 250 people still clinging to her as she went down. Captain Luce was still at the starboard paddle wheel, holding his son, until he was sucked down into the water. The ship sank out from underneath him. Paul Grand said he heard one fearful shriek and saw the passengers swept forward against the smokestack, and then all was over. Luce came back to the surface and found a most awful and heart-rending scene presented itself into my view. Over 200 men, women, and children struggling together amidst pieces of wreck of every kind, calling on each other for help and imploring God to assist them. Such an appalling scene may God preserve me from ever witnessing again. Captain Luce managed to swim back to the surface while holding his son all the while. As he treaded water, a piece of one of the Arctic's paddle boxes suddenly erupted out of the water next to him, having broken off the ship. The box struck and killed his son while he was still holding him. Luce ended up clinging to that same paddle box, along with 11 other survivors. And then the Arctic was gone. Second Officer Balham's boat stumbled into some overdue good fortune. They encountered the partially filled port quarter lifeboat. The loads of survivors between the two were equalized, with a total of 45 people between them, and then they set off in the direction of Newfoundland's coast, guided by what glimpses of the stars they could get. Twice, these two little lifeboats spotted ships but went unnoticed. And, finally, on the morning of September 29th, they landed at Broad Cove, Newfoundland. The survivors then walked for miles to the village of Renews. There, they were surprised to find the Vesta in the harbor, intact and afloat. She had survived the collision and limped to shore, saved thanks to her watertight bulkheads. Vesta's crew had described the accident as a hit and run by the Arctic. Numerous attempts were launched to look for more survivors of the Arctic. The schooner, John Clement, spent a whole week searching, but only found the Arctic's flagstaff. Other ships only sighted debris. Meanwhile, some of the other lifeboats eventually spotted other ships and made for them. Borean's lifeboat had 31 people in it, 32 once they found Peter McCabe, who was the only one of 72 people clinging to a makeshift raft to survive a freezing night. And they all rowed to the Canadian bark Boron. Meanwhile, Captain Luce and the others who were clinging to the wreckage did so for 2 days until the sailing vessel Cambria found them. Only Luce and 2 others of the 11 survived. 3 of Arctic's lifeboats were never found, or rather the occupants were never found. Those 3 boats were the one left behind when the Arctic made her mad dash for land, the one taken over by the engineers, and the one launched under control of the ship's quartermaster. No traces of those people were ever found, except for the lifeboat that had been left behind when the Arctic left the Vesta to try to stop herself from sinking. In November of 1854, it was found empty by the schooner Lily Dale with the oars still inside. Another missing lifeboat, the Port Guard boat, was found that December, again completely empty with no sign of those who had been inside of it to be found. In total, of the roughly 400 passengers, 61 crew and 24 male passengers survived. All of the women and children died in the disaster. William Brown's wife Clara, their 2 infant children, his 2 sisters, were all lost, including Captain Luce's friend Millie Brown. So was Mrs. Edward Collins, her daughter, and her brother's wife. Captain Luce never went to sea again. He worked as a ship inspector for the Great Western Marine Insurance Company until his death in 1879 at the age of 75. Despite the disaster, the Collins Line continued to run its ships at full speed. In 1856, the Pacific would disappear without a trace. A note found in 1861 on a remote island claimed that she had been sunk due to an iceberg collision. In 1857, another Collins Line vessel, the SS Adriatic, was laid up after only a single round trip. Vesta, meanwhile, was fully repaired and returned to service. She sank in 1875. The Collins Line suspended operations in 1858 after both the loss of the Arctic and the Pacific hit them hard. The remaining vessels of the fleet were sold off to new owners. Of the 4 original sister ships, the Baltic lasted the longest. She remained in service from 1850 until 1880, when she was scrapped. First, how is this not more widely known? This absolutely is a story that should be. 2, how has this story not gotten the Titanic treatment when it comes to being remembered, and at the very least been made into a film? A movie along the lines of A Night to Remember, striving to only be as historically accurate as possible, is something I would love to see, because it would mean that the story would become more widely known, even if it would be terrifying and harrowing and heartbreaking to see it recreated. There is a reason why the loss of this ship is called a disaster. And I'm not gonna lie, I got a little choked up while recording this. I think you can hear my voice break near the end of the sinking section. And as you know, we've talked about women and children first and the origin of that. The fact that that was just thrown to the wayside here, there was no glorious honor to the end in this story. In this story, many did act with valor and dignity, something we all associate with things like the story of the Titanic. But this story also had the opposite, and it showed people at their most vulnerable, at their most scared. And in a way, I understand the panic and the rush for the lifeboats. You know, that this was going to be a tragedy when the ship was struck. It just wasn't something that we see as a glorious one with dignity to the last, like the Titanic or the Birkenhead. It was just utter panic an absolute nightmare. And I understand the fact that not everyone has it in them to willingly stay on a ship to the end. I cannot condone, shoving women and children out of the way to get into a lifeboat first at all, but at the same time, I understand when people are panicked that they will do anything. It's a tragedy, but not the kind of tragedy that people in history like to remember. And I think that's why this story is so forgotten, because, people essentially threw the women and children to the lions and tried to just save themselves. And it's tragic. And you wonder if this didn't all play out on the Pacific too. She just vanished without a trace. For all we know, she struck an iceberg that left a similar amount of damage and maybe took hours to sink too. But that story is utterly lost because no one survived and the fate of the Pacific is unknown to this day. I really wonder what the Arctic looks like now. As they say in Titanic, to see the sad ruin of the great ship. But is there even much of a ruin left? The hull is probably mostly gone. It was just made of wood. Some of the machinery, plates, and, clothes probably remain, and I'm sure part of the hull does too, but the Arctic has never been found, and I'd like to see her found because while all shipwrecks tell a story, this one would tell a particularly tragic one. A tragic story that is woefully forgotten and needs remembering. Titanic, I love her and her story as much as anyone. She gets all the attention, and these other stories need to be told so they're not forgotten. Even the unpleasant ones, like this story, deserve to be told and remembered. Again, absolutely cannot condone the actions that people did, shoving people out of the way to get in the boats, pulling guns on passengers and forcing them back while you get into the lifeboats to try and save yourself. Cannot condone that. That is absolutely horrible, and it only made it worse. But again, it's a story, like all tragedies, that we should remember and we should learn from and strive to be better. And most of all, we need to remember it so the people who died are not forgotten. And I hope you enjoyed hearing this all but forgotten story and understand why it should be remembered. And with that, that is the end of the video. This story was a tough one to read about. I think this is the first time I've ever gotten a little choked up while recording a video. But I'm happy I told it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and check out some of my videos on other maritime stories that are little known but need to be told. I'll put some on the screen at the end, so please check them out. Have a good one, everyone. Tell me what you thought of this story and other stories that you know that you'd like to see me tell. And thank you for watching.